"Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" They replied, "Caesar's." At that he said to them, "Then repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." Some have taken this passage to at least imply that our civil duties and our religious duties are separate things. This reading of the gospel would miss the drama of the malice and hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the condemnation they received because of it from Jesus. The Pharisees forbade the payment of the temple tax and the purchase of animals for sacrifice with the coin of Caesar, precisely because the coin bore a graven image which was forbidden by the commandments, but because it also bore a blasphemous inscription. On the 1st of January in the year 42 BC, the Roman Senate recognized the divinity of Julius Caesar, giving him the title the Divine Julius. Augustus, Tiberius, Nero, and Domitian would all use this title for themselves, Son of the Divine Julius, and their coins bore this inscription. The pretense of this title would be used in the future to condemn Christians who refused a pinch of incense to those who had made themselves divine. The Senate may not have really believed it. The Caesars probably did not believe it, although Nero might have. Nevertheless, in their pride, they cared little for the truth of the matter, and their lies would later be the reason for the slaughter of Christians. That the Pharisees certainly were in cahoots with the Herodians cannot be doubted. And Herod and Pilate will become fast friends because they both refuse to acknowledge the truth when they encounter the only Son of God. It is true that the temporal and religious spheres have their own authorities, and it has historically been a messy thing when kings pretend to be the head of religions, or when clerics attempt to divide their loyalties. One need only think of the famous martyr St. Thomas More, who uttered these words at his execution: "I die the king's good servant, and God's first." God's first. We owe civic duties to our society, but they are second, not first. St. Paul will identify himself as a slave of Christ Jesus, doulos, not merely a servant, but given over whole and entire to one master. This clinging to Jesus will be repeated in Christians throughout the world, time and again down through the centuries. It will also be the reason why totalitarian governments cannot abide the existence of true Christians. Oh, they might permit you to think it in private, to worship in private, here and there, but only for a time. Eventually, they always seek out the ones who serve God first. The fabric of our society is not only frayed at the edges, it is completely coming undone. It seems every election cycle, there are more and more fractions and contentions. we hardly seem to be a union of states anymore. In the middle of all these difficulties, we suffer from lack of true information on the one hand, and an excess of information on the other hand. We're bombarded with so many details and so many facts, it's hard to sift it. It has become increasingly difficult to avoid confusion, especially in the political realm. How then do we repay to God what belongs to Him when we vote? A Catholic does not separate from himself or herself the teachings of Jesus Christ and His apostles or their successors when he or she votes. We belong to Christ completely and without reservation. As the servant of God, Dorothy Day, put it, if we rendered unto God all the things that belong to God, there would be nothing left for Caesar. We ought to be the same persons in the pew on Sunday in the church that we are in the voting booth. God's first. There are three categories that are very important. They are not the only categories, but they are the most important categories. The sanctity of human life, the sanctity of marriage, and religious freedom. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops gives us this teaching. The threat of abortion remains our preeminent priority because it directly attacks life itself, because it takes place within the sanctuary of the family, and because of the number of lives destroyed. At the same time, we cannot dismiss or ignore other serious threats to human life and dignity, such as racism, the environmental crisis, poverty, and the death penalty. The conference goes on. Decisions about political life are complex and require the exercise of a well-formed conscience aided by prudence. This exercise of conscience begins with the outright opposition to laws and other policies that violate human life or weaken its protection. Those who knowingly, willingly, and directly support public policies or legislation that undermine fundamental moral principles cooperate with evil. The Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith under Cardinal Ratzinger gave us this. A Catholic would be guilty of formal cooperation in evil and so unworthy to present himself for Holy Communion if he were to deliberately vote for a candidate precisely because of the candidate's permissive stand on abortion and or euthanasia. When a Catholic does not share a candidate's stand in favor of abortion and or euthanasia, but votes for that candidate for other reasons, it is considered remote material cooperation, which can be permitted in the presence of proportionate reasons, or as our Conference of Bishops would say, in the presence of very grave reasons, very serious reasons. The moral theology that undergirds the permissiveness of material cooperation in evil comes with these reasons. And we actually use this quite often, although we may not be aware of actually going through it. So, for example, I must shop for groceries. I don't grow my own food. and I don't check to see what are the stances of the different grocery stores. I have limited options. Right? These are the rules that we follow to think through. The greater the evil that is indirectly willed, the closer the union between my act and the evil effect, the greater the certainty that the evil effect will ensue, the greater the agent's obligation by reason of his position to prevent the evil effect, so much more serious must be his reason for permitting the evil effect. The sanctity of human life is at the top of our list when we look at political issues. We do not ignore the other issues, but the issue of abortion is our preeminent priority. It comes before, it stands above everything else. The issue before us now is not one of a status quo. One party views the right to choose an abortion as the paramount defining issue of their policies. They have pledged to codify into law, to remove any meaningful restrictions, to allow foreign aid dollars to be used for abortions abroad, and federal taxes to be used for abortions here at home. It is the reason for which they oppose any nominee for the federal courts that they think might decide unfavorably in the future with regards to the right to have an abortion. In my estimation, no economic policies, no international accords, no ecological or climatological advances could possibly justify the horror of calling this evil of abortion a good. I used to wonder at the existence in our history of those who read the Bible and sang the praises of God, but held as legitimate the enslavement of their brothers and sisters made by the same God whom they worshiped. I no longer wonder. When we have a practice, a law, a policy in effect, do not think that it doesn't affect the whole of society. Little by little, such a grave injustice affects everything else, and we become desensitized to it. It just happens to be the world that we live in. We're no longer repulsed by the horror of it. 150 years later after slavery, and the sins of the past still haunt us in many ways. What will be the price this nation will pay for the slaughter of innocent babies in the womb? We can never have a just society as long as we accept such evils. Just like totalitarian governments, little by little, what is called a right will be imposed upon each of us. If you do not accept their idea of marriage, you might lose your business. Catholic adoption agencies have already had to close their doors because they won't adopt out children to same-sex couples. We were told that everyone just wants to live and let live. But as we have seen again and again, they have no intention of just letting you live. You will be forced to agree with their ideas. They have repeatedly attempted to force religious orders, the Little Sisters of the Poor, to violate their consciences by trying to force them to provide contraceptives and abortifacient drugs for their employees. And now they have said to an 8-year-old that they will change the laws of the nation to permit an 8-year-old to have a sex change, even if it is against the wishes of the parents. These politicians think they can determine by law what is right and good, over and against, and without any reference to God's revelation. They wish to declare themselves divine, and they will force us to offer a pinch of incense at the altar of their horrors. They are already busy teaching all of these horrors as rights to our children, our grandchildren, to my nephews. My brothers and sisters, human life does not belong to Caesar. It belongs to God. Marriage does not belong to Caesar. It belongs to God. And our religious liberty does not come from Caesar. It is given to us by God. Catholics must oppose all of these things with all our heart, all our mind, the whole of our life, and yes, even with our vote. Whose image do we bear upon our souls? To whom do we give our loyalties? To Caesar or to God? Will we be able to say with St. Thomas More, I die as a servant of God first? I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible.